camera. If perhaps Eunice, you could, oh, here we go. Great. Ah, lovely. Thank you so much. Okay, great. I want to thank everyone for joining us for an important panel discussion, and we certainly thank the College of Law for being such wonderful partners in this endeavor. It's an honor to co-sponsor this occasion. We're very fortunate to have three speakers well qualified to speak about the humanitarian situation in Afghanistan after the US withdrawal, each from a different vantage point. Each one has been asked to speak for approximately 10 minutes or so, so we'll have time for questions at the end of the session. In the interest of time, let me begin and I'll get right into introducing our panelists. The first one is Aisha Wahab. We're very pleased to have her here. I'm glad she could take time out of her busy schedule to join us. She's a council member of the city of Hayward in California. When she first won her seat on the Hayward City Council in 2018, she made national headlines as the first Afghan-American woman elected to public office in the United States. As mayor pro tempore and city council member of Hayward, she's dedicated to addressing issues including housing affordability, civic engagement, education, and economic inequality. Prior to her career in public service, she worked at nonprofits, community organizing, and in technology. Aisha previously served as the chair of the Alameda County Human Relations Commission and a board member for the nonprofits Afghan Coalition, Abode Services, and Tri-City Volunteers. She's also served as an Alameda County Public Health Commissioner and an organizer and speaker at the Bay Area Women's March. In 2013, she was selected to join the White House Roundtable of Afghan American Leaders. So welcome, Aisha Wahab. We look forward to hearing from you. Thank you.
You guys want me to begin right now, right?
Yes, please. Thank you.
You know, I appreciate this opportunity to kind of talk a little bit more about Afghanistan. I will tell all your viewers that I was born in New York City, and my parents are no different from the struggle we're dealing with today. Specifically, my parents came to this country seeking political asylum in roughly the late 80s. And soon after I was born, my father was actually murdered in New York City. With that said, my mother passed away a while later, and both my sister and I ended up in foster care in New York City. An American judge made a decision for us when our extended family petitioned for us to come to Afghanistan. That American judge made a decision that we as two young girls will not be sent to Afghanistan, a region that's inhospitable to women. That was probably the best decision made in the best thought process as to what is the best for the children. And I am incredibly grateful to that American judge and for the decision to do the right thing. I can stand here before you as the first Afghan American woman elected to public office in the United States. And the mere fact that whether or not I, had some difficulties in life, growing up in foster care, bouncing from home to home, and eventually getting adopted, I am far more fortunate being here in that system than growing up under war, under warlords that are raping and pillaging different cities, Taliban rule, lack of internet, lack of electricity, lack of clean water, living in poverty. And that is the story of Afghans today. I'm happy to address any other questions or anything like that, but I will say a couple of things. Number one, the reason why it is so important to help our allies is because, number one, we made them a promise that if you serve the United States by serving in our intelligence or interpretation or translation or you name it, you will be granted the opportunity to come to the United States with your spouse, as well as any child under the age of 21. People took this risk knowing that this is committing treason by the average Afghan standard, let alone a Taliban or leader in the country. By all standards, even in developed nations, treason is still punishable by death. In Afghanistan, they will pursue that punishment. And it's, again, not just the Taliban, but other individuals that feel this way. So we must honor our promise. Our veterans have really stepped up, specifically knowing that these are the people that helped them in Afghanistan, in a war-torn country, that risked their lives to save our soldiers. And it's only right to do what we can to help them come here in safety. There are significant concerns about women, about children, ethnic and religious minorities. And I really want to highlight to pretty much anybody that's watching is that Afghanistan never had a negative history with the United States. Historically, the hippie trail of the 50s, 60s, and 70s was something that Westerners went to Afghanistan. I'm not going to lie, many of them have told me that they smoked a lot of marijuana as well on this trail. And many individuals participated in the Peace Corps. And the relationship between Afghanistan and the United States was actually a very positive one. In fact, King Zahir Shah and his wife, the Queen, were hosted by President Kennedy. After Kennedy's assassination, the King actually sent a telegram giving his condolences. President Eisenhower actually visited Afghanistan, and much more. I often want to walk away from the left and right argument regarding which president is to blame for what failures we've had in Afghanistan. The honest situation is that the relationship with Afghanistan in a war-like state has actually happened since President Jimmy Carter's time. So I really want to walk past that and really focus on the humanity and the compassion needed today. Afghanistan is a landlocked country dependent on their neighbors for electricity, water, trade, and much more. These neighbors are not the friendliest neighbors. It is Pakistan, India, China, Iran, and Russia. And their strategic location in Central Asia is the reason why there is a theory called the Great Game Theory that has actually taken place for the last several hundred years of people trying to dominate Afghanistan. With that said, I do believe that in the future, there will be more bloodshed before there is ever peace in Afghanistan. And it is our responsibility to take care of those who took care of us, as well as see what type of humanitarian aid, as well as diplomacy, can work in this chapter of United States-Afghan relations. And the city of Hayward, as Mayor Pro Tem, I have been working with a wide variety of different individuals at the state level, the county level, the city levels, and people have been reaching out to see what we can do. And their number one concern will be housing and jobs. And I'm happy to talk more about it, but I think that's sufficient for you guys to ask any questions potentially.
Thank you very much. I think if there are any questions, if people want to put them in the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen, please do so. Otherwise, I think we'll move ahead, but I so appreciate having you here. I know this is a concern for us. We know Tucson is a resettlement community for refugees, and we know that Afghan refugees will be coming. So we're doing our best to, we're ready to work with our students who are studying Persian and other languages that are, we hope, relevant in this case, and with the local Iranian and Afghan communities as well. So we've had an outpouring of offers from people in the community to assist with just the kinds of things that you've been talking about. So we look forward to continuing with that and to welcoming people to our community. Okay, I don't see any questions, so I'm going to go ahead then and introduce our second speaker. Our next speaker is Dipali Mukhopadhyay. She's an associate professor in the global policy area at the Humphrey School of Public Affairs at the University of Minnesota. Her research focuses on the relationships between political violence, state building, and governance during and after war. She currently serves as a senior expert on the Afghanistan peace process for the U.S. Institute of Peace. She's the author with Kimberly Howe of the forthcoming book, Good Rebel Governance, Revolutionary Politics and Western Intervention in Syria, and in 2014 published the book Warlords, Strongman Governors and State Building in Afghanistan. Her scholarly publications include articles in prominent journals on conflict, negotiation, and politics, and a series of book chapters in edited volumes. She's vice president of the American Institute of Afghanistan Studies, of which the University of Arizona is a proud institutional member. She's also a term member of the Council on Foreign Relations. So it's my great pleasure to welcome Dipali Mukhopadhyay. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anne, for having me. And it's a real pleasure to be here and an honor to follow after Aisha Wahab. What a moving American story that is, and such an important reminder of how long the relationship, for better and for worse, has been between the United States and Afghanistan. I made my first trip to the country in 2004 as a graduate student and fell in love with the place and the people, and was most recently there just 6 weeks before the Taliban took Kabul. So I thought I would start by sharing a little bit about what the past few weeks have been like for me. Pretty much from morning to night, there are messages streaming into my phone, coming from people that I know, and mostly from people that I've actually not met before, from Kabul and from a number of other cities around Afghanistan. And they have sentences like, "Is there still any chance, any hope? I have been super stressed. I don't know what to do. I'm very sorry for being so clingy. I feel embarrassed, but I have no other option. I never thought it would come to this. I am out of plans. Nothing seems to work." These messages have been coming to me from professors and soldiers and journalists, poets, activists, students, government officials, dozens of Afghans from very different walks of life, with one thing in common, that they are being hunted by the resurgent Taliban. And most of them begin their notes with a list of their credentials, and most of them close with a plea, some version of "please help me." For me, the catastrophe of the evacuation is the coda that punctuates and exemplifies the American project of building an Afghan state. The past 20 years have been only in part about that project. More importantly, they were a quest on the part of the United States and its allies to avenge the attacks on September 11th. And so in that sense, building an Afghan state has been a means toward an end rather than an end in and of itself. State building in the service of countering extremism was always then about the creation of a government that would be loyal to and dependent on outsiders. The very design of that government ensured its fragility, and so its rapid collapse was actually not that much of a surprise to those of us who were studying it on those terms. Until President Biden announced plans for the withdrawal, the military presence took up very little space actually in the American collective imagination. Part of that is because the burden of that presence was being shouldered by a small number of Americans. Another part of it was that if we understood what that military presence was doing, its function was actually primarily a political one. The boots on the ground represented a kind of commitment to the fledgling Afghan republic. And that commitment encouraged otherwise an unwieldy sort of cabal of elites to hold together and stay invested in the government's preservation. And that presence also deterred the Taliban from pushing for an all-out military takeover. So most of us who observed the conflict over the last 20 years believed in the merit of an eventual US withdrawal, but we knew that the manner in which that withdrawal was managed could mean the difference between a viable peace process and the government's collapse. A precipitous, unconditional American withdrawal was bound to be read by everyone involved as defection on the part of the world's most powerful nation. So the Taliban's incentive to negotiate with the Afghan government, which was already limited, would evaporate, and otherwise brave and well-trained soldiers in the Afghan army, which had been designed to be dependent on the US for maintenance, for contractors, for fuel, material, etc., that those soldiers would lose their will to fight. So I made my last trip to Kabul, as I said, just weeks before the city fell. And the trip began for me with a birthday party for the daughter of one of my closest friends. And even in the middle of these festivities, there was a sense among my host and my guests of anxiety. They were equally alarmed by how out of touch their own president seemed in this moment of existential reckoning, but also how quickly they were being abandoned by their American friends. And I think it's important to stress that these were not victims looking to be rescued or saved. They were citizens seeking accountability for the promises that had been made to them by their political leaders and by their foreign partners. None of us knew that just a few months later, they would be forced to join this panicked exodus. These friends of mine had no intention of ever leaving their country, certainly not in the way that they were forced to at the end, sitting for days on buses in the Kabul heat while Talibs checked and rechecked their documents, turning them away repeatedly. Most of them didn't make it into the airport. As their journey began, for those who did make it, I was at home making lists with a motley crew of people, many of whom I've never met and probably never will, who were running these makeshift war rooms, working around the clock to navigate Afghans that we knew through the Taliban checkpoints and into the airport. We were communicating by encrypted text. We were using satellite imagery, trying to find gaps and loopholes in the American bureaucracy, and marshaling all of our complementary networks to share information. I'm not sure I'm ever going to recover, to be honest, from this experience of making these lists, because they have involved an obscene set of calculations. Are there too many children in this family to put them on this list? Are the threats to this journalist scary enough to get the attention of American policymaker? Will women make for more compelling victims than men for this donor that's looking to fund a flight? All of my collaborators in this effort carried their own lists, and we found ourselves negotiating with each other. I will give you certain information if you will put someone on my list, on your list. This was the indecent work of turning productive, capable agents of change into objects for rescue. And here's where I think we find the crux of the problem when it comes to state building in the service of the so-called war on terror. The governments that we built were not designed to be sovereign. Their budgets were made to be dependent on aid, their security sectors reliant on foreign equipment and contractors. Negotiations that we held elevated insurgents and marginalized their diplomats. And their citizens were afforded some rights sometimes, but not if those freedoms undermined the geopolitical interests of more powerful states. And that's how, in the flash of an eye, those more powerful states transformed the Taliban from mortal enemy to security partner, because a scarier terrorist, the Islamic State, had emerged on the horizon. And it's how their friends and partners in Afghanistan learned that they were in fact dispensable once their more powerful patrons decided to move on. And so in that sense, the end of the American war is not very different from its beginning, but the hypocrisy undergirding this effort, I think, is especially now on display. Because today, and if you've watched any of the hearings on the Hill with Secretary Blinken, you will see a kind of insidious narrative taking hold. This idea that the Americans and our allies tried to give the Afghan people and their leaders a chance at democracy, but they didn't take us up on that generous offer. And now it's time for us to admit that promoting good governance abroad is hard to do, and we're better off focusing on important matters at home. And I think for me, it's very important that this narrative not stand, and instead that we tell the truth, which is that the Americans invaded Afghanistan to our own ends. And we did so in terms that crippled the state building project, that made secondary efforts at democratization in a number of meaningful ways. We created those dependencies, we created those conditionalities and those restrictions. And in that sense, we doomed the project before it ever began. I think an opportunity remains here still to seize on the positive externalities of that effort, though, because there is a paradox at the heart of this war, that opportunities for Afghans to embrace citizenship, modernity, globalization, cosmopolitanism, all ideas and projects that actually have existed on their own terms in Afghanistan for more than 100 years, that those opportunities were opened up once more by the intervention in 2001, even as they were threatened and undermined by the means that that operation ran its course. And so I think an opportunity exists now to recognize our Afghan interlocutors as profound agents of change in their own lives in the course of their country's history, and to think about what it might look like finally for the Western world to engage them on their terms rather than on ours. And I think it's an invitation that I hope we take up, and I'm happy to engage more about what that could look like in the conversation with you. So thank you very much for having me, Anne, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so very much. I really appreciated both that analysis and the discussion of your personal experience that informs it. Before we go further, I'd like to mention there is one question in the Q&A section, and so I wanted to ask that so as not to miss it. Is there an agency or organization that one can contribute to that that will be able to help the Afghanistan citizenry? So which organizations would you recommend? I know the International Rescue Committee is going to be welcoming refugees, and they're in need of support, but we'll welcome any other thoughts you may have, so any suggestions. So, Dipali, are there any organizations?
Sure, yeah. So Aisha has put one organization into the chat. There are many, and I'm happy to send a list to you, Anne, that we can then send.
Thank you. Yeah, we'd love to post that.
Yeah, who've attended. I know that MSF, Médecins Sans Frontières, which is also known as Doctors Without Borders in the US, will be continuing its work inside Afghanistan. So for those who are interested in, I think there'll be two different efforts we'll need to think about. One of them is thinking about how to support those Afghans who have been displaced and hopefully who we will be welcoming into the US. That's one set of organizations. The other set of organizations will be those like MSF who will continue to work inside the country, inside Afghanistan for the 33 plus million Afghans who will remain. And so happy to send along some more details on that.
Thank you very much. And thanks to Aisha for providing the link also to Afghan Coalition. I appreciate that. And as soon as we have that list, then we will post it on the center's website. So thank you. Okay, well, now then I'd like to turn to our third speaker, David Gibbs. He's a professor of history at the University of Arizona. A former MacArthur Fellow, his writings have appeared in many newspapers and magazines and been translated into 11 foreign languages. His book, First Do No Harm, Humanitarian Intervention and the Destruction of Yugoslavia, was published in 2009 with the Serbo-Croatian translation published in 2010. He also wrote The Political Economy of Third World Intervention, Mines, Money, and US Policy in the Congo Crisis. Professor Gibbs authored the chapter Afghanistan and the Politics of Quagmire, a retrospective analysis of US policy in the edited volume Rebuilding Afghanistan in Times of Crisis, a Global Response, published in 2019. Also in 2019, he debated Michael Chertoff, former Secretary of Homeland Security at the Oxford Union Society at Oxford University, on the topic of humanitarian intervention. David Gibbs is now completing his third book, to be entitled How America Became a Right-Wing Nation, Politics in the 1970s. So I'm very pleased to welcome Professor Gibbs. And so David, take it away. Oh, you're muted. If you can. Thank you. Oh, I can't. We can't yet. There. Oops! It came and went. There we are. That should work.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Okay, thank you for the introduction. My link to Afghanistan is somewhat different from the other two speakers, in that my main specialty has been the acquisition and analysis of declassified documents from the US and the Soviet Union over a period of many decades. And I suppose the main conclusion I've drawn from having studied these documents over time has been the extraordinarily cynical quality of foreign intervention, including by the United States. I know this is a panel on humanitarian aspects of the crisis, but and this is, U.S. policy has often been presented in humanitarian terms, but it's really very difficult to take the humanitarian motive very seriously if you look at this project very closely. First of all, at the level of effects, the effects have been somewhat catastrophic from a humanitarian standpoint. The last 20-year war that has been fought there as a result of the US overthrow of the Taliban has killed upwards of 150,000 Afghans. Those are the official figures. Unofficially, it's reasonable to assume it's probably much higher than that. Many more times that figure wounded, no doubt. And though one doesn't want to overemphasize the US casualties in this context, it is worthy of note that if one includes the contractors in the US casualty list, about 6,000 Americans were killed. So the human toll here was very high indeed. As far as I can tell, very little to show for it, at least at a humanitarian level. All of this, I would say, was predictable and as well as avoidable. It so happens that in 2001, when the US decided to overthrow the Taliban controlled 90% of Afghanistan. Afghanistan was on the verge of having peace for the first time in 20 years. Admittedly, under very brutal rule, the Taliban were certainly not nice people, but it probably would have been better to have simply settled the fighting then and not plunged Afghanistan into another war, which is exactly what the US did. And it was also predictable. It is not as cliche to say that Afghanistan is the graveyard of empires, but it's true all the same. And it was surely an act of extraordinary recklessness for American officials to believe they could subdue Afghanistan and impose a government in Afghanistan in a way that for some reason the British were unable to do and the Soviet Union was unable to do. And indeed, in retrospect, the US was unable to do as well, with catastrophic results. At the level of motive, I think it can be said that, very clearly in 2001, there was some overlay of humanitarian purpose, liberating women and so on. I think the main consideration here was that American prestige and the image of power suffered a blow with the 9/11 terrorist attacks, and the United States had to make up for that loss of prestige by a vigorous assertion of military power, even if in the end it was not very positive from the standpoint of US image after 20 years. Very little of this basically had anything to do with humanitarianism. There is a doctrine in international relations theory called realism, which holds that humanitarianism is almost always a pretext for selfish national interests. And I think one can see that very clearly in this particular case, even if the results are extraordinarily tragic and very, very unfortunate. One can basically look at kind of the US role in destabilizing Afghanistan. And of course, the US wasn't the only country, but since we're focusing on the US role here, one can look at, go further back in history. During the 1980s, you had the war against the Soviet occupation being fought by the Mujahideen guerrillas. And the Central Intelligence Agency, in the largest operation in the history of the CIA, was giving massive supplies to the Mujahideen guerrillas. It was known at the time that the Mujahideen guerrillas were, as the Secretary of Defense, Caspar Weinberger, put it, not nice people. But nevertheless, the US objective was to fight the Soviet Union, and we didn't really care whether or not they were not nice people that we were backing. The Soviets weren't so nice either, but that's a different story. The United States basically was giving massive amounts of weapons and equipment to really pretty brutal figures with very brutal records indeed. And I don't have a lot of time to go into this, but the fact is the United States was intimately involved in groups who later morphed into the Taliban and really helped build up groups as well that morphed into Al-Qaeda. And this was foreseen as a potential problem. The CIA was training the Mujahideen in classic terrorist techniques, and where they were viewed as terrorist techniques, and gave them weapons that would be ideal for the use of terrorism. And that's exactly what happened. The CIA also collaborated, this is a matter of records in military journals from the period, with a young Saudi playboy who liked violence and blowing things up, named Osama bin Laden. It's well documented that the CIA did indeed collaborate with Osama bin Laden. And it was pointed out at the time in congressional hearings that a lot of these things could result in terrorism and destabilize Afghanistan if the Soviets left. And the CIA didn't really care because they were fighting the Soviets, and that's really all they cared about. We can go further back, basically, in the US record here in destabilizing the country in 1979, when there was a civil war in Afghanistan between the Mujahideen and the Afghan government. The Soviets were concerned about the security of their southern frontiers and considering invading. Officially, the United States publicly was shocked by the possibility of a Soviet invasion and was trying to avoid one. We now know from the declassified documents, the US was trying to encourage a Soviet invasion because it felt that if the Soviets were to invade, it would basically sort of lock them into a Vietnam-style conflict, but which would damage them and cause them to withdraw in humiliation, which of course happened. This is particularly evident from records of Zbigniew Brzezinski, a former national security advisor to President Carter, who more or less, I'm sorry, let me get a document that just fell, admitted this in a 1998 interview with a French magazine called the Nouvel Observateur. And in that 1998 interview, I translated it into English. He openly admitted the US role here was to try and encourage the Soviet invasion. I'll just read you an excerpt. I'll be brief in the reading here. The French journalist began with a question, quote, "The former CIA director, Robert Gates, stated in his memoirs that American intelligence services began to aid the Mujahideen in Afghanistan 6 months before the Soviet invasion. In this period, you were national security advisor to President Carter. You therefore played a key role in this affair. Is this correct?" Brzezinski: "Yes. According to the official version of history, CIA to the Mujahideen began during 1980. That is to say, after the Soviet army invaded Afghanistan on December 24th, 1979. But the reality, closely guarded until now, is completely otherwise." In other words, Brzezinski was lying to the American public when he basically said the US wasn't aiding the Mujahideen. Indeed, it was July 3rd, 1979, that President Carter signed the first directive for secret aid to the opponents of the pro-Soviet regime in Kabul. And that very day, I wrote a note to the president, which I explained to him that in my opinion, this aid was going to induce a Soviet military invasion. In other words, Brzezinski said, if we give aid to the Mujahideen, it will probably trigger a Soviet invasion, which of course occurred. We should do it anyway. And then the French journalist asked, despite the risk, you were an advocate of this covert action, but perhaps you yourself desired the Soviet entry into the war and looked for a way to provoke it? Brzezinski: "It wasn't quite like that. We didn't push the Russians to intervene, but we knowingly increased the probability that they would do so." It's a self-contradictory statement. And I think the carry away there is, yes, we pushed the Russians to intervene. I'll read a little bit more of the interview because I don't have much time. Question: when the Soviets justified their intervention by asserting they intended to fight against secret US involvement, nobody believed them. But there was an element of truth to this. You don't regret any of this today? Brzezinski: regret what? The secret operation was a great idea. It had the effect of drawing the Russians into the Afghan trap. And you want me to regret it? The day the Soviets crossed the border, I wrote to President Carter, we have the opportunity of giving the USSR its Vietnam War. Question: and neither do you regret having supported Islamic fundamentalism, which gave arms and device to future terrorists? Brzezinski: what's more important, the Taliban or the collapse of the Soviet empire? A bunch of agitated Muslims or the liberation of Central Europe? Anyway, so there you have it. Okay, Brzezinski, acknowledging that he provoked the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, boasting about it really, and having set in train a series of events, all right, that destabilized the country for 40 years, which it hasn't emerged from to this day. So in any case, I think what lessons we can learn from Afghanistan. There are quite a few, but I think one of the principal ones is the idea of using military intervention to achieve humanitarian objectives is one that really should be brought into very serious question as a result of the record of information that we now have about the long-standing US involvement in Afghanistan. You're muted, Ann.
There we go. All right, thank you so much. I really appreciate that. So we've discussed something of the history, the unfortunate history in many respects of American involvement with Afghanistan. But now I think it's a good time to look to the future, as Dipali suggested we might. And this goes along with the question that's asked by one of our attendees who chooses to remain anonymous. This person writes, watching the news, it's easy to get overwhelmed and discouraged thinking about Afghanistan's future. Can we discuss a little more some solutions for how Afghans can reclaim Afghanistan from the Taliban and how we can contribute to that effort from abroad? I should mention that recently we heard one of our own faculty, Fatin Roshan, talking about how she feels the US government has a finite period to encourage UN peacekeepers to go in and encourage a coalition government, including the Taliban, Northern Alliance, and other groups, and it's important to be mindful of that limited amount of time available to us. But I'll be really interested in any responses from our panelists. If you can, yes, Aisha, please.
Well, I think it's fair to say, as I mentioned, that Afghanistan is a landlocked country that is going to be dealing with a lot of neighbors. It is a concern as to what is going to be our engagement, whether we agree with the government or not, whether we like the Taliban or not. We're not in a position to dictate that to any other country, and we should not be playing that card. The real concern is, what is our relationship, given that China has already stepped in saying that they will be working with the Taliban. Our promotion of women's rights across the nation and across the world, in fact, as well as our humanitarian / diplomacy with these types of nations. The sad reality is that we have invested so much into war and never utilized another tool in our tool belt, which is diplomacy. I think that is the biggest lesson that we should learn as Americans, and in particular with Afghanistan. I think, as I mentioned earlier, I think that there is going to be significant concerns there. I think there's going to be more bloodshed. I think that there will be another, battles for power and so forth. Pakistan is largely not viewed as independent. They're viewed largely being supported by Pakistan. So regardless, it's what is our relationship with this country? And that's the biggest, I think, discussion that the State Department and any administration should be having for the next 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, and moving forward in our international affairs. But for us, I do think, and I've said this many times, and some people are a little surprised, I actually think that Afghanistan and the rebuild of that nation should have been in a way that is modeled after Israel. Israel in particular, being what, 76 plus years old, the birthright trips, the investment in regards to the relationship, and being the country it is today, Afghanistan could have used that model. You have Afghans in the diaspora that, born and raised in America, but obviously have roots heritage-wise and want to help in some capacity. There could be different models. The Peace Corps could have been rebranded and brought into Afghanistan, and not this, control of the government and so forth, but different efforts there with United States presence in a military sense, just for stability and security for the Americans that want to volunteer. I think that there are plenty of different ways to achieve the same goals without the bloodshed and without our own troops, that sign up and are no longer here with us today. So I think that there's different ways to tackle these issues.
Thank you. Dipali, would you like to comment on this as well?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think as you mentioned in the introduction, I spent the last year working with the U.S. Institute of Peace on trying to understand the peace process from, if there ever was one, from various angles. And I think one of the things we had hoped was that the Taliban would be vulnerable to a kind of international pressure, given its ambition to be recognized by the international community. And I think at this moment, I feel much less optimistic about the kind of leverage actually that the US and its allies have. And I'm not sure actually, to come back to several of David's points, that in fact there is much constructive to encourage in terms of American involvement in the Afghan nation building process in its newest chapter. I think in a lot of ways, what we find, and Aisha's comments also, I think, reflect this, that Americans are very good at breaking systems that don't work for them in the moment. But I think often end up instrumentalizing what could otherwise be constructive efforts in the service of their own security interests at the time. And so that's, as I said in my opening comments, how we end up in a situation with a government that collapses and a security sector that collapses despite enormous investment and a lot of time. That's how we end up in a situation with the Taliban resurgent and now seen as a necessary partner of sorts in the ongoing war on terror. And we should be very clear that this particular chapter of the war may be over, but even just 10, it seems like years ago, but it was very recently, the drone strike in response to the suicide bombing at the airport took the lives we now understand most likely of 11 individuals who had nothing to do, in fact, with the Islamic State. And that's the kind of action that I think we will continue to see the American government engaged in. And so in a lot of ways, I think what the American citizenry now is in a position to do is start to pay attention and reflect on what the last 20 years have involved, and call on our leaders to not engage in those kinds of activities that seem to serve our short-term interests, but fundamentally keep us in this trap where I won't be surprised if in a matter of a few years, I hope I'm wrong, but I wouldn't be surprised if in a matter of a few years, there is an attack on the homeland that emanates from some group in Afghanistan, and we begin this whole cycle all over again. So I think a lot of what we need to do in this moment is not necessarily think about what should we be doing, but really be reflecting on what we've already done and the damage that we've already done and how we can avoid that going forward. And the kinds of policies over which we have the most control are those that allow Afghans to relocate here who don't feel safe, that allow, as Aisha said, for us to take our rightful place in a multilateral effort anchored in UN Security Council action that is diplomatically oriented, that thinks about humanitarian assistance, and fundamentally hit pause on a lot of the other stuff we've been doing that has produced as much, if not more, harm than good.
Thank you. We have a comment from one of our graduate students who mentions that in a recent podcast, one of our faculty members, Dr. Fatin Roshan, said that in 2009 or so, that the overwhelming majority, if not all, of Afghanistan's GDP was from external humanitarian aid. And she writes, I understand that likely doesn't account for informal markets, but how do we reconcile realism with what appears to be a genuine dependency on humanitarian aid? Can you differentiate between state-funded humanitarian aid like US aid and NGO aid? It's an interesting puzzle because the amounts of aid pouring in were enormous and people became dependent on them. It also encouraged corruption. So that what next question is really important. how does one move forward?
I guess just, I would say that any further engagement by the US or the United Nations should be focused exclusively on sort of depoliticized provision of humanitarian aid, things like vaccines, for example, or maybe Land Rovers to deliver the vaccines to remote areas to the extent that that's very likely necessary. But any kind of politicized involvement involving any suggestion of external intervention has been so profoundly discredited. I can't imagine that having anything but negative effect at this point, and should be avoided. It must be also pointed out how extraordinarily expensive any further, just reflecting on what Dipali said about possible future intervention if, let's say, there's an attack emanating from Afghanistan. The expense of this, in addition to the lives, is just financially colossal. Afghanistan, 20 years of war has cost $2.3 trillion. That's equivalent of 10% of the US GDP in any given year. Imagine what kind of wonderful things the United States could have done with $2.3 trillion rather than waste it. So, depoliticized humanitarian aid is as far as the international community should go in Afghanistan, and nothing more than that at this point.
Yeah. Thank you.
Can I just jump in on that point too, Anne?
Please do.
That's also very much my impulse, but I wonder if we're capable of it, in the sense that, I think this boogeyman of terrorism and of extremism will continue to persist, and the presence of the Islamic State, in which we should recall is very much, an effect of the cause of the 2003 Iraq War. It's hard, I think, to imagine a US engagement that doesn't continue to be framed in those terms. I was just in a conversation actually earlier at Columbia on the question of, which Afghan refugees should we be prioritizing? And even the notion that only those who work directly for the US military receive priority, whereas everybody else falls somewhere down the list. It's a reflection of the way in which we seem, even in the most obvious of humanitarian crises, of moments, to always apply the lens of our own security interests. And so I think it's a test of the possibilities of thinking about these questions differently, but the track record is quite poor.
I think the opportunities that we have most immediately before us relate to the people who will be coming to the United States and whom we can assist, as well as the opportunity for people to think about Afghanistan and learn from it. It's a country in which we've been involved for so long, and yet the attention to it has been so minimal. It really is a shameful thing. But with people coming, we've encountered the same thing you were mentioning, Dipali, about this sort of hierarchy of, whom do we help? We've worked with Kabul University with some faculty and students in a distance learning project on cultural heritage management to help develop, we hoped, experts on cultural heritage management to serve there, and had some very interested students. But now, just for having been involved with our project, which was funded by the US National Park Service with State Department money, some of those people are endangered, not because they were translators or involved in military activities or supporting them, but because they were studying. It's really tragic. So we're very concerned to assist them in any way we can, but we too are coming up against lots of barriers because there are others who are being helped first. There are people who have higher levels of priority. We're not giving up, but it is dispiriting, to say the least.
Can I also reference this? Pan Am actually had a partnership in the 50s with Afghanistan, the only Asian country they actually partnered with to create Ariana Airlines. And the reason why I keep referencing everything before the 80s is because, to your point, we have short memories. And these countries, older countries, Asian countries in particular, have very long memories. I'm going to speak very frankly, they sometimes hold on to beef that happened 200 years ago, right? With nations that invaded and so forth. The Taliban, whether, as I've mentioned many times, whether they are supported or not supported, they have and must request the assistance of foreign nations. They are landlocked. So holding aid and humanitarian priorities and women's rights and things like that as kind of the, we will give you the carrot or the stick, depending on what your interaction is and how you engage on these issues, I think should be something that we utilize as a tool. But with that said, I do also want to mention that Afghanistan's history is that very similar to, as I always like to say, Game of Thrones, in the sense that the southern border by international law technically does not really exist, in the sense that it has already been expired. Afghanistan should and must touch the sea in order to be able to be more independent and not have to have this many foreign entities interested in Afghanistan. Afghanistan also has some of the world's largest resources in regards to 21st century resources like lithium and so forth. So there's always an interest, but they are going to rely significantly on the partnerships with foreign governments. And China in particular has been probably one of the best, in the sense of they are partnering by just donating $1 more, or betting $1 more, or even a cent more for these mines, copper and so forth. That is the way to go about it. It's not always military. And if we talk about the economy, that's kind of the goal that we should be having, because everyone is looking to grow. And the average Afghan is living under $2 a day, to be completely frank.
Thank you. There are two questions that I hope we'll have time to address to some degree. I'll just put them both out there so you can respond as you wish. One relates to women's rights. Our person attending has written, in my belief, the women trapped in Afghanistan will become victims. Dipali pointed out, how do we organize whom to help? Wouldn't women be a priority simply because of the danger they're in? And here I would just comment that women are members of families. And one of the challenges that we've had is in our associate director, Julie Ellison-Spaten, working with a student. The student sent in a list of so many relatives to come with them, and we said, well, it's supposed to be just immediate family. But I think in Afghanistan, as Iran, immediate family is much more extensive than it is in the United States. These ties are deeply strong, and to take people apart is a really hard thing to do. And the other question, again, please choose what you'd like to comment on. It says, can we talk a little bit about the withdrawal agreement that was made last year between the Taliban, US, and Afghanistan? What are the lessons learned from how the American withdrawal from Afghanistan went?
Well, I definitely like to touch the withdrawal. Honestly, we keep blaming the different administrations, and they are largely responsible. I will say, I've had conversations with the State Department and different individuals who have served and covered Afghanistan who were disappointed with the withdrawal. The plan was not really well vetted, and everything was based on a timeline, and a timeline that was not vetted by this current administration. At the same time, the previous administration worked out a deal where 5,000 Taliban soldiers would be released from prison, including those who have served time for a wide variety of, different crimes, if you will, that they should never technically even have been released. But with that said, when we talk about the discussions between the Afghan government, which was really not included in the withdrawal discussion, the fact that our US military left in the middle of the night without telling the Afghan army, and the mere fact that this is not the first time that these discussions, when it says it is important to be at the table, it truly is important to be at the table, because the original 2001 Bonn conference also excluded individuals to begin with. It did exclude the Taliban. And so now this conversation with the Taliban excluded the Afghan government and women. Women were excluded from pretty much any conversation, including during the Bonn conference. They were not prioritized. And the king's family during the Bonn conference was forced to sign agreements that they would not pursue the crown, a king that has served for 40 years in a relatively peaceful time. And I want to highlight this because not every form of government that we believe is appropriate or correct in the United States applies to cultures that are very different than the American culture. You know, these are tribal people. These are individuals that, again, have years of history and years of memory. Whether we understand it or don't understand it, it's a different community. And we truly, even in business, we often talk about how culture eats strategy. And we have to understand that even in these conversations.
Thank you. Dipali?
Yeah, I'll just want to really underscore Aisha's point. I think it's impossible, you know, I alluded to this in my comments. I think it's impossible to understand one of the best ways to understand the entire war is to look at the withdrawal, and the withdrawal, the agreement between the United States and the Taliban in 2020 set the stage for the withdrawal. And what that agreement did was effectively underscore the fact that for the United States, the existence of a government in Afghanistan was not as a sovereign partner, but in fact as the object of certain policies, the recipient of certain kinds of support, but ultimately a secondary concern to US interests. And so the Taliban was elevated through that negotiation. And initially, the framing of the process was, as Ambassador Khalilzad had put it, nothing will be agreed until everything is agreed. And in fact, that turned out to be a false promise, because the only way in which the Afghan government could have credibly sat across from the table with the Taliban and hoped to survive that negotiation in some way, shape, or form would have been if the US had lent its leverage of having troops on the ground to that government, because that's the Taliban most wanted, the American troops gone. By giving the Taliban that promise of troops leaving without pushing in any meaningful way for a peace process to take hold, essentially damned the Afghan government from that moment onward. And I think that is a part of the legacy that we will have to confront. And actually, one of the original sins in the Bonn process, similarly, in a kind of mirror image, is that the US government refused to allow the new Afghan government to include the Taliban, which had been severely, resoundingly defeated at that time. And reportedly, members of the Taliban and the leadership sought a surrender. But for the Americans, the Taliban were the bad guys associated with al-Qaeda, and the means of resolving the conflict were secondary to framing this as a war on terror, if you're with us or against us. And so in a lot of ways, that was the original sin. Would we even have had an insurgency? I think remains an open question, not unlike the de-Baathification policy in 2003 in Iraq. So I think it's very important to understand that agreement as one of the bookends, with the Bonn process as the other, of how we ended up where we are today.
Thank you. Well, I think that our time is just about at an end. I think this is a good place to stop, in that it's really helped us understand a lot more of what's gone on. I think that original sin is often, it comes down to a lack of respect for our partners. If we were to treat them as equal partners from the very beginning and listen and pay attention, that things could go differently. And that's often left out of these calculations, unfortunately. So moving forward, we can at least do our best to, as citizens, encourage the government to participate in that way in their partnerships. And I hope you'll all be able to participate in some fashion in welcoming the Afghan citizens who come to the US. We really, I think, do owe them a lot. So thank you all very much. Thank you, David Gibbs and Aisha Wahab and Dipali Mukhopadhyay, for taking time out of your very busy schedules. And we so appreciate you sharing your insights from the important work that you do. And